KNW Saturday Morning News with Joe Bennett.
Well, we've talked about bikes and bike lanes on this program many times. One of the issues, or one of the areas we haven't really looked at, is injuries and crashes, and certainly that happens quite often on the roads. Joining me on the line is Anthony Thomas. He's a managing partner at Simpson, Thomas & Associates. Anthony, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on your program.
Oh, we have talked about this a little bit, and we talked to ICBC a few weeks ago about what happens when we deal with bike crashes. Now, your law firm deals a lot with the aftermath of crashes. Do you anticipate it's getting worse, or do you see it getting worse with this big push we have to get more people cycling?
I haven't really seen a dramatic rise in bicycle accidents in my practice, which is not to say there aren't more crashes. I know ICBC on their website, they have a section going back to 2007, and they reported accidents in 2007 actually were less than in 2006. What's happened since then, I'm not really sure, and that's province-wide. So I'm not aware of an increase in motor vehicle bicycle accidents in Vancouver area.
Your firm now, do you deal mainly with cyclists who are injured?
Well, we represent people who are injured, whether it's in a motor vehicle or a bicycle.
Because one of the questions, or some of the questions that have come out with the push to get more people on bikes, is what happens when we see crashes, if a driver is responsible or if the cyclist is responsible. I mean, are people supposed to treat it the same way as if you're in a crash involving two vehicles, that you stop, exchange information, and go from there?
Yes, that's correct. Whether if you are on a bike or in a motor vehicle, you're required to remain at the scene and exchange information. And as a matter of common sense, particularly if you're on a bike, it's very important that you gather witnesses if there are any available. Of course, attend to any medical needs that are there. It's important to report the claim to ICBC and of course, notify the police of the accident as well.
Would you say in most cases when you're dealing with people, is it more drivers at fault or cyclists at fault?
I'm not aware of any studies that would say one or the other. Certainly, cyclists have extra special precautions because they are less visible than motor vehicle operators. So I'm not aware of statistics as to who bears the majority of fault. Certainly, in both cases, it could be driver inattention, whether it be the cyclist or the motorist. I know that over 50% of motor vehicle accidents do occur in the intersections. That could be a failure to yield from one side or the other. I would hazard a guess that more often it's a motor vehicle driver not seeing the cyclist because they're not as visible.
We did a bit of a non-scientific study where one of our reporters went and sat at the end of the Dunsmuir Viaduct a while ago and counted the cyclists. And I think he counted about 200 cyclists, or almost 200. But of those, 50 of them blasted through the red light at the end of the viaduct. If a crash is caused because a cyclist disobeys the rules, be it blasts through a red light or does something else, then are they then liable for injuries incurred in that crash?
Well, if a cyclist is injured and by colliding with a motor vehicle and it's the cyclist's fault, technically if the an occupant in the motor vehicle is injured, they would be responsible for those injuries. Now, if a cyclist is injured through his or her own fault and it's the result of an accident with a motor vehicle, the cyclist would have no claim for his or her own injuries in terms of a bodily injury claim. They would, however, still be entitled to what we call accident benefits, or ICBC no-fault benefits. So that would include disability benefits while they're off work. It would include access to ICBC's extended health plan, or again what we call Part 7 or no-fault benefits. So even if a cyclist is at fault, they by virtue of an accident with a motor vehicle, they would be entitled to certain no-fault benefits, but they would not be entitled to a claim for their own injuries.
So even if they don't have insurance through ICBC, if they're on a bike and they don't own a vehicle?
If the collision occurs as a result of an accident with a motor vehicle. So, for example, if a cyclist is riding his bike and without contacting or in any way being an accident being caused by a motor vehicle, so they just fall off or run into a telephone pole or something like that, there would be no access to benefits or a claim against ICBC. So the key there would be it must result from a motor vehicle accident.
But even if it's the cyclist's fault and the cyclist runs into a vehicle, a moving vehicle, say, if the cyclist doesn't have insurance with ICBC, they still have access to that?
They would have, if it's a cyclist's fault and the cyclist is injured in colliding with an accident, even if it's the cyclist's fault, they would have entitlement to ICBC's no-fault benefits, which would include disability benefits for while they're off work and extended health benefits for medical rehabilitation and treatment. If the cyclist is at fault, there would be no ability to make a claim against the other motorist. Now, if the cyclist is injured through the fault of the operator of a motor vehicle, ICBC would, the cyclist would have a claim not only against ICBC for accident benefits, but also against the other motorist for bodily injury claim, loss of earnings beyond what would be paid as disability benefits, loss of income earning capacity, things of that nature.
And does it factor in as far as safety requirements? Because even though wearing a helmet is law in this province, we see a lot of cyclists out there that don't wear helmets. Does that factor in if you're in a crash?
It may. That's an interesting point. I believe roughly, and again this goes back to a study about 2 or 3 years ago, that over 50% or around 50% of accidents involve cyclists who were not wearing a helmet. Now, if a cyclist is not wearing a helmet, that does not disentitle the cyclist to claim for injury. And what would happen is if a cyclist is injured and is not wearing a helmet, if the helmet would have in some way prevented or lessened the injury, and so we're dealing then with a head injury, the cyclist could be found contributory negligent for failure to wear a helmet. And so the claim for damages could be reduced by virtue of the cyclist's failure to take that precaution of wearing a helmet, which is required under the Motor Vehicle Act. If, however, a cyclist is not wearing a helmet, but, for example, injures his or her knee in a collision with a motor vehicle, then the helmet would really have no bearing on the knee injury, of course, so that would not factor into the claim for damages.
What should people remember as far as if you are in a crash involving a cyclist, or if there's two cyclists or a vehicle and a cyclist? What do people need to remember as far as obviously getting witnesses, but you might be in shock, you might be caught up in the moment, you might be hurt. Are there things that you need to do, though, to make sure if you are injured, you can go to someone like you and make sure that you are compensated?
Yes. Well, you make a couple of good points. First of all, often cyclists, particularly given that they are in such a vulnerable situation when they collide with a motor vehicle, often are in no condition to take the necessary steps to protect their own interests. If, assuming a cyclist has is medically capable of and has the wherewithal to do the normal proper steps, they should, of course, ensure that any witnesses who are around are contacted and they get their information. ICBC must be notified as soon as possible, and there's an ICBC dial-a-claim center where you can call to notify them of the claim. The police should also be notified, and of course any medical treatment or help that is needed should be called or summoned immediately. If a person is involved, a cyclist in an accident with a motorist who leaves the scene, it's vitally important that the cyclist do everything they can to try and ascertain the identity of the owner and or driver of that vehicle. It is imperative that the cyclist contact the police immediately and certainly within 48 hours. ICBC must be notified of the claim as soon as reasonably possible, and in any event within 6 months, but in fact it must be done as soon as possible. And the cyclist should also, aside from trying to get witnesses, advertise if need be or post signs in the area to try and determine if there were any witnesses to the accident.
Very timely advice given the push to getting more people on bikes. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us and talking about this today.
Again, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Anthony Thomas, he's a managing partner at Simpson, Thomas & Associates.